Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 24th of September of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. First we're going to talk about the most important direction and we're going to talk about the battle for Vuhledar. As you can see, we have a lot of icons starting from the village of Velika Novoselovka. We have geolocations to the north in Constantinople and we have geolocations along the line of combat contact in the Vuhledar direction itself. Let's start with the fire anomalies. As you can see, the territory is under complete Russian fire control. The towns of Novaya Ukrainka and the town of Bagayavlenka was shelled by the Russians, and as you can see there are very huge and big fire anomalies, which confirms that both cities are under very heavy fire, and we have some geolocations that confirm this. The thing is that the Ukrainians can't keep their forces on the territory of Vuhledar, at least they can't keep too many forces on the territory of the citadel of the stronghold, because the Russians have almost encircled this territory. The Ukrainians can keep just small rearguard forces. The main purpose of them is to hold the lines as long as possible. Meanwhile, the main Ukrainian forces are stretched between the towns of Shakhtarskaya, Novoukrainka and Bagayavlenka, and the Russians are bombing these territories. Furthermore, during the previous 24 hours, we got the video of how the Russians were moving from the south in the northern direction, trying to get as close as possible to these towns, and this is the video. In this video, we can see significant number of Russian armored vehicles and tanks. This is basically Russian offensive operation. We see almost no resistance from the Ukrainian side. Yes, the Ukrainians are trying to bomb the Russians, to attack them with FPV drones, to attack the Russians with artillery strikes, but the Ukrainians couldn't do anything. The Russians managed to cross fields, to land infantry, and to secure additional square kilometers of the territories. And based on the vector, based on the direction of Russian movements and Russian attack, we see that most likely the Russians are planning to move further in the western direction and to take everything at least until this red line. If the Russians are able to do this, then the Russians will be able to cut the lines between Novoukrainka and Bagayavlenka, to split this territory in two and then to handle with every single direction separately. And most of all, the first direction is going to be Novoukrainka direction. Now let's move further. Let's talk about Vuhledar itself. At the beginning of the 24th of September, different mappers confirmed that the Russians managed to improve their positions in the southwestern direction of the citadel. So these fields, including farms, were captured completely by the Russians by the morning of the 24th of September. Furthermore, the same sources reported that as a result of clashes, the Russians reached the eastern outskirts of the citadel, and furthermore, the Russians managed to enter and to take under control first buildings of the citadel of the stronghold. So this is approximately the territory that was captured by the Russians by the morning of the 24th of September. Now let's talk about the progress during the day. The different pro-Russian sources reported that as a result of clashes, the Russians managed to improve their positions along the tree lines, and basically the Russians, let's say, maintained the line of combat contact, maintained the gray zone, improved logistics, because despite the fact that the Russians are about to finish the battle for the citadel, of course, it's always good to have good logistics. So the Russians tried to make it better. Furthermore, during the day, we got report that the Russians managed to take under control a very important, the most important stronghold that located to the west of Vuhledar. So this territory was captured by the Russians, and this was confirmed by neutral mappers. So this is the situation, and according to this configuration of the line of combat contact, we can make a conclusion that most likely the town of Vuhledar is already encircled by the Russians. Most likely the Ukrainians lost their possibilities to evacuate personnel through fields, or this process will deal significant losses for the Ukrainians. So as from this configuration, maybe the Ukrainians still have possibilities to move in the northern direction along the eastern line, then a little bit to the west north, and then further in the direction of Bagayavlenka. Maybe the Ukrainians still have possibilities to do this, but obviously without taking with them armored vehicles, personal carriers, and they can't take a lot of weapon. They can use just everything they have in their hands, ammo, some shields, and to go further in the northern direction. As for the citadel itself, we have very important statement that was published by the forces, by the official channel of the 46th Air Mobile Brigade, that is also responsible for this direction. Basically, 72nd and 46th brigades are the core of defense of Vuhledar, and today the 46th brigade reported that in Vuhledar the order is to stand to the death and hold the city at least until the end of the visit. So we understand what kind of visit the forces of 46th brigade were talking about. We understand that it is an order from Ukrainian authorities to hold Vuhledar until the end of the meeting between Zelensky and Joe Biden. So Zelensky, he needs to have a good picture that Ukraine are able to hold the lines despite absence of any supply support, despite the difficult situation on the ground. As you know, the meeting between Zelensky and Biden is going to take place on the 26th of September, but most likely by the 26th of September the Ukrainians will lose the town of Vuhledar. From this city itself, from the citadel itself, we receive some geolocations. Most of these geolocations are just about how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions, and yet we haven't received even a single video that confirms the Russian presence on the ground. So just artillery strikes, several destroyed mortar systems somewhere in the eastern part, in the northeastern part, just that. No videos that can confirm Russian progress on the territory of Vuhledar itself, which is very important. But I believe that tomorrow, on the 25th of September, or by the beginning of the 26th of September, the Russians will raise their flag somewhere in the eastern part or the northeastern part, and obviously this is going to be a complete disaster for the Ukraine, because nobody can tell for sure right now where exactly the Ukrainians are able to stop the Russians if they take under control Vuhledar, Novoukrainka, and Bogoyavlenka. Some people are saying that Ukrainians most likely will try to slow down the Russians on the line Velika Novoselovka, Bogatyr, Andreevka, so basically from Velika Novoselovka to Kurachovo water reservoir. But for example, today we got lots of fire anomalies from this territory as well, so most likely the Russians began an artillery preparation in this direction. Russians understand that currently is the vital and decisive moment for the Russians and for the Ukrainians, and if the Russians are able to launch full-scale offensive in the direction of Velika Novoselovka and to break through the Ukraine defense belt, the consequences of combination of these attacks can't be predicted by anybody. And I'll remind you that either both Vuhledar, Kurachovo, and Pokrovsk is the last defense belt before Dnipro River and cities like Zaporozhye and Dnipro. If Ukraine lose Velika Novoselovka, Vuhledar, Kurachovo, and Pokrovsk, Selidova, then most likely within the next 3-4 months the Russians may get the Dnipro River and to begin assault and siege of these two cities like Dnipro and Zaporozhye. As for Zaporozhye, during the previous 24 hours we continue receiving updates of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the industrial zone of this big city. In this video we can see another barrack, another some warehouse, ammo depot, or industrial zone that was attacked by the Russian FAB bomb. You know that the Russians recently managed to improve their guided equipment for guided bombs, and currently they managed to increase the range of this type of weapon up to 80 kilometers, which allows the Russians to stay in invisible zone for Ukrainian air defense, or at least for the rest of Ukrainian air defense, because currently the Ukrainians have significant problems with this. Now let's return back and let's go to the Kurachovo direction. There are very heavy clashes in this area as well, and today the sources reported that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over the village by the name of Zhelana Druge. So this information was confirmed by pro-Russian mappers and by neutral mappers. This is very important progress, because because currently the distance between edge positions of the armed forces of Russian Federation and the village itself and the northwestern part of Krasnogorovka is less than 4 kilometers, and this is already a cauldron. So most likely the Ukrainians have already abandoned their positions in this artillery pocket in this trap, or about to do this, and they will finish this process during the upcoming night. So obviously the night between the 24th and the 25th of September is the most important night of early autumn military campaign, which will determine significant number of things in the late autumn campaign. Now let's move further. The Russians understand that Ukrainians, if they evacuate soldiers, if they evacuate forces, most likely the Ukrainians are using this road for evacuation that lays between the village of Zaryana, Kurachovka, and then further in the western direction to Ilinka. So that's why the Russians have no problem to establish complete control over this territory, and during the previous 24 hours, as you can see, we received significant number of geolocations of how the Russians were FPV droning and attacking the Ukrainian forces, Ukrainian positions, Ukrainian communication exactly on this line. This is very important because this is also another step, another way how to increase the Ukrainian losses during the creation of cauldron or during the retreat process. Now let's move further. We have additional updates from Tsukurina. Just yesterday we were talking that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to take under control the coal mine and to reach the railways, and today we start receiving updates that the Russians moved further in the southern direction, and as a result of clashes the Russians established complete control over this stronghold. This information was provided by a reliable mapper. Now let's move further. We continue receiving updates about very heavy clashes in Marinovka. Still, this village remains under complete Ukrainian control. The Russians are trying to attack this territory from many directions, but every single attack from the Russian side was repelled by the Ukrainians, and the Russians, suffering losses, were forced to fall back. So as for now, Marinovka remains under Ukrainian control. The Russians suffer huge losses, and they still haven't managed to take this territory under their control. Now let's move further. Pokrovsk is under very heavy fire, and we got the map of dense network of the fortifications around this city, and the most important that the main concentration of the fortifications is already under complete Russian control. This line in the central part of this picture was already captured by the Russians during the 2024, and as you can see around Pokrovsk there are just few icons, few lines, much less in comparison with the line that the Russians managed already cross. And as you can see, if we are talking about the left corner of this picture, we see that there is almost complete absence of any defense of the armed forces of Ukraine. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians continue bombing and attacking the city of Pokrovsk, trying to destroy logistics, trying to discover and to destroy Ukrainian howitzers and so on. So obviously, summarizing everything, the city of Pokrovsk is under siege. Of course, there are still lots of things to do, but obviously, during this year, the Russians will not be able to take the city under control. We expect the beginning of the battle for this stronghold somewhere in the beginning of 2025. Maybe by the end of the 2024, the Russians will begin offensive operation in the direction of Mirnograd, just to take under control some part, to get inside of the city during the winter period of time. And during the winter, the Russians will just bomb attack the eastern part of Pokrovsk and trying to force the Ukrainians to fall back. So something like a duel between Mirnograd and Pokrovsk we might see during 2024. Now let's go to the Toretsk direction. As you can see from this territory, we haven't received anything, nothing special, some archived video. I'll remind you that just yesterday the Russians destroyed the biggest construction of the territory of the coal mine, and we are expecting that soon we're going to receive some changes on the ground, significant changes in Russian favor. As for the Kupiansk direction, the Russians stopped for a while after the Russians took under control the village of Nevskaya, and after the Russians established complete control over Makeyevka. Now the Russians are focused in the securing of the territory between two two villages. Some mappers have already adjusted their maps and colored this territory completely in Russian favor, but obviously it's impossible to take such a big territories in one day. There is a very big and very complicated process of the executing and the clearing of the territory, and most likely the Russians are about to finish this, and then the Russians will move further in the southern direction. Some pro-Russian mappers have already adjusted their maps to the south of Nevskaya, and according to them, as a result of clashes, the Russians managed to take under control some fields, few more square kilometers in the direction of the village by the name of Novosadova. So if the process begins, then most likely tomorrow we will receive additional updates from different neutral and pro-Ukrainian mappers. As for the northern Kupiansk direction, the flower of Pishchana is continue blooming. We have additional progress on the ground as a result of clashes. The Russians took under control few square kilometers further in the southern direction along R79 roads right in front of the village of Kruglakovka. Once again, as we discussed in the previous videos, most likely the Russians are trying to force the Ukrainians to fall back from their positions and fields between the village of Lazova and Berestova, and now the Russians are trying to create another cauldron. And to do this, they need to move further in the southern direction. And of course, we should expect additional active intensifying of actions from the Russian side to the west of Mesazharovka with the purpose to connect two forces to attack Fis somewhere here. And obviously, if the Russians begin this offensive, the Ukrainians most likely would be forced to fall back. As for the city of Kupiansk, the Russians continue bombing and attacking the territory of this town. This is very important logistical hub. The Ukrainians have significant number of armored vehicles, of just ammo depots, different supply places, engineering service centers. Everything is ready for a very long-term siege from the Ukrainian side. So that's why the Russians still have a lot of things to do, and they were bombing and attacking the city. Now let's move to Volchansk. We have additional and very important updates. If you remember, somewhere on the 17th of September, we have adjusted the map. We adjusted the map in around the aggregate plant in Ukrainian favor because the Russian sources published the video how they were bombing and attacking the aggregate plant by the artillery, reporting that they were bombing the Ukrainian positions. And based on this video, we have adjusted the map in Ukrainian favor. And today, on the 24th of September, the Ukrainian sources published the video of how they were taking under control the aggregate plant completely. The Ukrainians are saying that today they finished the securing operation, and as a result of clashes, they managed to restore control over this part of Vovchansk. This is very important because we see that the Russian interest to Vovchansk is being reduced from day to day. The Russians have no interest to hold their positions in this area anymore, and the Russians are retreating. The Ukrainians, of course, raised their flag in the final part of the video, which confirms complete control over this territory. Once again, after the beginning of the Kursk offensive, first of all, not even about the Kursk, after the failure of Russian Volchansk offensive operation, because the Russians expected that they would be able to take this, at least the northern part, very fast, but that Russian attacks were repelled and they haven't managed to complete the battle for the northern part. The Russians decided to fall back. They decided to fall back and to remove their forces towards more reliable positions, probably inside of the forest or at least in the northern part of the city. The Ukrainians most likely during the next few days will continue restoring their positions along Korolenko Street, and after that they will stop as well, because the Ukrainians also see no reason to continue offensive operation further, because the territories to the north of Volchansk have no value, at least in this stage of the special military operation. As for the Kharkiv direction, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians published the video how they discovered and destroyed one bridge in the central part of Liptsi. Maybe we can expect additional activization from the Russian side due to collapse of Ukrainian logistic and the central part of the village. As for the Kursk direction, heavy clashes continue in this area, but during the previous 24 hours we haven't received anything that can confirm additional changes on the ground. And now it's become clear to us the main purpose and the main goals of the Russian counter-offensive operation, and I remind you that as a result of Russian counterattack, the Russians managed to restore control over the villages of Snagost, Bukhovka, Pokrovsky, Darina, Nikolaeva, Darina. There are lots of villages that were recaptured by the Russians, and we have confirmation. Some of them still considered as a contested area, but anyway, we see that the Russians stopped. The Russians stopped, and the Russians most likely are not going to move further in the eastern direction, which confirms and which means that the Russians most likely have just one goal, just one purpose of this counterattack: to restore supply lines that goes from Korineva to Glushkova. The Russians managed to create a significant number of pontoon bridges, but most of these pontoon bridges were under complete Ukraine FPV drone control, and the Russians were suffering significant losses during the process of redeployment from forces from the north to the south. And by the Russian counterattack, they managed to create a safe and reliable supply road. And I remind you that the Russians began their counteroffensive 2 days before the beginning of Ukrainian offensive in the direction of Glushkova. And as for the current situation, the Ukrainians still haven't managed to achieve any result. The Ukrainians were completely defeated. They suffered significant losses, and probably the reason why the Ukrainians failed is that the Russians managed to conduct successful counterattack and to restore access to supply and support from the town of Korineva. This is very important. In this video, we can see 2 more Ukrainian artillery systems that were destroyed as a result of Russian artillery strikes. So the situation in the Kursk direction remains the same without any changes on the ground. Of course, the most important updates are coming from the United States of America. Most of the leaders arrived on the territory of New York. Currently, there are lots of meetings between lots of people, lots of presidents. Everybody is talking just about things. Everybody is talking about Ukraine. There are lots of talks, and not just Ukraine, of course, but Ukraine is the topic number one. And one can say that it appears that countries like United States of America, Germany, probably China, ask Zelensky to surrender. But Zelensky is the only member of this event who doesn't want to surrender and who wants to continue the special military operation. Russia refused to join the second peace meeting. Joe Biden still hasn't authorized Ukraine to use long-range missiles deep inside the territory of Russia. For example, Trump, from his side, refused to have a meeting with Zelensky. Zelensky because wants to have meeting with Biden, Trump, and Kamala Harris, but Trump refused because he says he has different plans. So the situation is not so good, and Ukraine peace plan failed, obviously. And currently, we have reports that Western countries began searching for additional connections, communications with Russia regarding the question of Russian idea, Russian understanding of the end of the conflict. So very interesting updates and events are waiting for us, and the most important is that nobody expects that the war will finish in autumn of 2024. Despite Zelensky wishful thinking, everybody understands that the special military operation will continue in 2025. And as for United Kingdom Minister of Defense, war will be finished in 2026. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.